All right. Well, good evening, and thank you so much for joining our roundtable discussion of comparative racisms. My name is Zahi Zalloua, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this event, co-hosted by the French and Francophone Studies Department and the Race and Ethnic Studies program. The event is in part funded by the Cagley Lecture Fund. Please note that this session is being recorded, so it can be made available to members of the community who are unable to join us live today. Given the theme of our roundtable today, comparative racisms, it seems quite appropriate to begin the event with a land acknowledgement statement. The land that Whitman College is on is the traditional territory of the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla tribes. This land was ceded in 1855 to the US government, resulting in the relocation of the tribes to the Umatilla Indian Reservation and allowing for the establishment of Whitman Seminary, now Whitman College, 4 years later. So settler colonialism serves as a key, if not necessary, background for thinking about racisms today. The genesis for this roundtable came from my many discussions that I've been having with my students and colleagues about the challenges of thinking anti-Blackness, of understanding what anti-Blackness is and what it isn't, how anti-Blackness is at once an expression of racism and something much more, something that is singular and irreducible to other forms of racism. Now, this point has been powerfully expressed by Afropessimist Frank Wilderson, who warns against what he calls the ruse of analogy, urging us to learn to differentiate between anti-Blackness and all other forms of racism. So for Wilderson, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism can be remedied without really challenging what it means to be human. Whereas anti-Blackness is premised on a certain negation of Black people. So overcoming anti-Blackness would require an overcoming of the human, any kind of psychic investment in this category of the human. So this roundtable takes up the challenge of thinking racism comparatively, a gesture that Wildeson would surely find problematic. But still, I don't believe that all comparative endeavors are a priori dubious. This roundtable acknowledges from the start that any parallel between racisms must be drawn with interpretive nuance so as to avoid overgeneralizations about racial arrangements and socioeconomic conditions that are by no means identical. With an eye for racial capitalism and its effects on violence and health, an anti-racist intervention declines to treat race in isolation or produce analogies that remain too abstract to have any purchase on the world. What good is an anti-racist intervention if it doesn't unsettle the social order of things? Philosopher Achille Mbembe draws out, for example, the historical and tragic connection between anti-Blackness and capitalism, a pressing matter for the present. In its neoliberal mode, capitalism is responsible for what Mbembe calls the becoming Black of the world. Only the obscenely wealthy are spared from blackening, from instrumentalization and animalization under a capitalist logic that bestows luxury to the 1% and dishes out misery to the rest, reproducing, producing a never-ending stock of new slaves. Our panelists today will consider the incommensurability of racial subjugations, the intersection of race with other interlocking forms of oppression, and the possibilities for cross-racial solidarity. Now, to tell a little bit about the structure of our roundtable. Each participant will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. Then panelists will have a chance and opportunity to ask each other questions for about 15 minutes. And finally, we'll turn to questions from students and faculty in the audience. And please use the chat function to ask questions. And also to remind folks, our speakers have generously agreed to meet with interested students for a more intimate follow-up to the roundtable at noon tomorrow. Please contact me for Zoom link information if you would like to join this follow-up conversation. Now to introduce our speakers. My remarks will be brief to leave more room for Q&A. Lydie Modileno is Marianne Frances Chevalier Professor of French and Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. This is Lydie's return to Whitman after a talk some years ago. It was about 15 years ago or so. It seemed quite distant, but also a great event, a great memory. So welcome back, Lydie. Her recent publications offer new examinations of race in contemporary French culture, mythologie postcoloniale, décoloniser le quotidien, postcolonial mythologies, decolonizing daily life, a study of race in popular culture at the turn of the millennium, inspired by the work of Roland Barthes, and postcolonial realms of memory, signs and symbols in modern France, a collected volume investigating traces of the colonial past in contemporary France. Yeah, the colonial past never really disappears, right? There's a kind of persistence of that past. Peter Hitchcock is professor of English at Baruch College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He is associate director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. His more recent books and co-edited works include Labor and Culture, or Worker of the Worlds, with the S in parentheses, Did That Age?, The New Public Intellectual, Politics, Theory, and the Public Sphere, and Biotheory, Life and Death Under Capitalism. Debarati Sanyala is professor of French and affiliated with the Design Emphasis in Critical Theory, the Institute of European Studies, and the Center for Race and Gender at the University of California, Berkeley. Her recent publications include the monograph Memory and Complicity, Migrations of Holocaust Remembrance, and the articles Calais Jungle, Refugees, Biopolitics, and the Arts of Resistance, and The Social Contract in the Game of Monopoly, Listening to Kimberly Jones on Black Lives. Her current project addresses the contemporary refugee experience in French-speaking testimony, fiction, and film. And our last speaker, Benedict Westrom, is Associate Professor of Afro-American and Afro-African Studies at the University of Michigan. She's the author of Creole Renegades, Rhetoric of Betrayal and Guilt in the Caribbean Diaspora, and Afrodog, Blackness and the Animal Question. Afrodog powerfully draws on recent debates about Black life and animal rights to investigate the relationship between race and the animal in the history and culture of the Americas and the Black Atlantic. And we'll proceed according to the order in the program. So, Lydie.
Great. So thank you, Zahi, for this welcome and for this welcome back. I'm very happy to be here virtually, and I want to thank you and all the programs that have made this this event possible. 8 to 10 minutes, I'm going to try. I would like to situate my remarks. Let me put my stopwatch. To situate my remarks within the broader category of language and of what I call unacceptable words. I would like to situate my remarks today in the context of, as you said, Zahi, work that I've been doing and pursuing in the last couple of years on the presence, the persistence, and the materiality of race in contemporary France, and particularly in the French everyday of the, first decades of the 21st century. This, of course, against the background of the so-called colorblind republic. I'm not going to use my time to remind you of this kind of French paradox of the so-called colorblindness. So in our work, postcolonial mythologie postcoloniale, postcolonial mythologies, my co-author Etienne Achille and I were inspired by Barthes to tease out with very precise, very concrete examples, to tease out how colonial ideology, racialized ideologies, still pervade the French everyday in the 21st century in a number of areas, mostly in popular culture, sports, foods, circulation of commodities, etc. So for today, I would like to continue to seek out and reveal what we have called, following the lessons from Barthes, the teneur coloniale, the content, the colonial content of the French everyday, basically the year 2020 and just 2 months of that. In other words, how colonial ideology surreptitiously infects the language, the objects, the representation of Black bodies and Blackness in the French context today, again, within the absence of legal recognition of race from the French government. So I want to ground my remarks in two case studies, more specifically, two events caught on tape, both images and sound, which have been widely reported and subsequently denounced as scandalous in France and in some cases abroad. Both involved non-white persons and the police. Both involved a combination of physical violence and insults. The first one is November 22nd, 2020. A Black man is going home, Michel Zecler. The police follows him home. They beat him up. They fumigate his studio. And while beating him up, repeatedly call him sale nègre. To this day, it seems to be that it was gratuitous, that there was no reason. So I just gave you the content of the insult. I will not give a PowerPoint today because I would rather not repeat the insults. Sometimes I will for the sake of my demonstration, but I will keep it to a minimum because my point and my argument is precisely against this kind of repetition. The second event is a month later, December 22nd, 2020. An undocumented person, apparently Egyptian, who was being chased by the police in the streets of Paris, jumped in the Seine River in an attempt to escape arrest. The audio of one of the young policemen can be heard, replying to his colleague who's worried that the suspect might escape and actually drown. Un bico comme ça, ça nage pas. There's laughter, there's a conversation, kind of like merriness in the group before they actually arrest him and they brutalize him in the police van. This is also part of the audio footage. Just as a kind of dictionary note, because it is a very nasty insult. It's a very derogatory term for a person of Arab or North African origin whose symbolic violence is deeply rooted in Franco-Algerian history and colonization and decolonization. As the French media reported, both for the November and the December event, une nouvelle bavure, these were new blunders, right? New police blunders. So as I said, each event provoked a wave of shock, where each event was widely accounted for on the social media and in the printed press. It was also reported in the UK in The Guardian and also in the Times. The New York Times, for example, mentions that Mr. Zecler still has trouble sleeping. His mind kept returning to the assault. And he said, focusing on the look of the police officers, that he could see, I quote, the hatred in their eyes and the racial slur they used against him, dirty with the N-word. That's how the New York Times puts it. So in the French context, that's why I gave you kind of the New York Times context. What strikes me is that in the conjunction of these two events, basically a month apart, what strikes me is how easy and how unproblematically the insults were repeated and reprinted, and how unharmed they actually circulated in the French everyday, from newspaper headlines to the radio in mainstream French radio. Compared to the US, the example of the New York Times tells us, the casualness of the reporting together with the actual repetition struck me as another layer of insult towards Black people and Black bodies in France. It seems like in both cases, both from the right, the left, and I mean, it was not politically distinguished, from Libération to Libé to Mediapart, it's as if the overwhelming choice by the French media was to focus on and to repeat incessantly, verbatim, the insults. sometimes in quotes, but even more shockingly, sometimes without quotes. Most of the time, in the case of Biko, I could see no quotes. The whole sentence was in quotes, but not the actual word. So this basically is what Achille Mbembe writes in Necropolitics in his section on nano-racism, when he talks about, I quote, the banality of nano-racism, I quote again, our era as an era of shameless nano-racisms. And I totally agree with this presentation, which I hope will come out of my two examples of a society, société du spectacle, right? The Borean société du spectacle, shamelessly violating the dignity of Black and brown people for the sake of profit. I stop at shameless because it seems to me that there was a symbolic violence not only in the obviously malevolent insults, but also in the lack of scandal, in the lack of memory of the power of the words that I just gave you at the beginning. It is not a very original move, but it's impossible not to bring up Fanon here. I'm sure that Zahi is already thinking about Zizek. But if we go and open up Fanon again in one of his most famous chapters, chapter 5, as you know, the opening is very powerful. And we know the first two words, what this insult, the same as for Michel Zecler. But what's interesting is that in the same opening sentence, Fanon actually suggests that for the Black man, there's actually little difference between the insult, the powerful one, and the more simple, the more casual one that is encapsulated in this tien, right? Hey, you know, tiens un nègre. So if you remember, he opens this chapter with sale nègre, and immediately shifts to tiens un nègre. And that's actually what he's going to repeat. And it's in this repetition that it's become insult. So I want to draw attention to this casualness that Fanon actually makes explicit further down in the chapter when he concludes, tiens un nègre, it was an external stimulus that flicked over me as I passed by, right? So that is the kind of Fanonian microaggression. So to go back to the study I alluded to, the Barthes mythology, I want to pose again at this flick over, and like Fanon in the 1950s, when the producer video came out last month or a month and a half ago, I was outraged at the beating up. I was outraged at the fumigation. But like Fanon in the 50s, the nausea came from the repetition over the next 5 weeks or so of the words. As a reader and as a Black reader, the sensational headlines operated like the flick, the chicanose that Fanon is talking about. Each time a little flick or jolt, manifesting what Barthes once called the naturalization of a certain ideology in the quotidian. And I would argue that the nonchalance or the banalization should be interpreted also as a sign that some words are still acceptable. It is legal, actually. It's not legal to insult explicitly, but it is legal to repeat. So to conclude, sorry for rushing, really. I want to propose that these jolts, these jabs, these flicks needs to be understood and replaced within a long chain of serial violations of dignity, and as such should be made acceptable. Of course, Emmanuel Macron called the two events not just police blunders, bavure, but he also called them unacceptable, right? But in a sense, unacceptable, one of his favorite adjectives anyway for the French stuff, unacceptable being a non-political move, a kind of continuation of the choice of ignorance by the French Republic, offering a kind of rhetorical zero tolerance, but at the same time, tolerating that words like those two insults actually populate and almost saturate the French every day in 2020. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction, but I do want to hold on to Liddy's point about this kind of relay of racism, which I take as a political and theoretical challenge. So overall, this has some theoretical propositions. Hopefully, I'll make them clearly enough, but we'll see. To think racism comparatively is a complex challenge, politically, philosophically, and of course, culturally. We know there are restrictive and expansive ontological demands that make of any mode of comparatism antinomies, which do not comport analogically with history, space, and identities fractured between. Yet surely we can track these genealogies and specify with great detail the autonomy of the production of race so that it might not further add violence to the original violence that race always already represents. A mode of separation among people that has been made to differentiate and rationalize oppression for centuries, millennia, and indeed what we now mark as the Anthropocene. But this itself is a rational kernel for a mystical shell, a reverse palimpsest of truth that would make of racial history a universalism that is precisely at political, philosophical, and cultural levels the very object of racial dissemblance and forms of solidarity bound to challenge and overcome the projection and indeed superimposition of some supreme race as the guardian of universality. As such, an anti-racism on behalf of race remains an antinomy, but absolute in its necessity to fight and redress the harm that racialism bequeaths. For instance, Black Lives Matter is a powerful response to a crisis that is at once an expression of a crisis, that the people of this world, Bumi Manusia, as the great Indonesian novelist Pramoedya Antatoa once put it, are riven by divisions of their own making that can only be fought and sublated on the terms of those divisions, until what makes them is made superfluous by such struggle. On this earth, there is that which deserves life, as Mahmoud Darwish suggests. I am a white man, or at least interpolated as such, and while I despise and have opposed white supremacy with a passion, what Giroid terms the invocations to whiteness, the thrall of white privilege does not disappear with disavowal. The adjudication of race must rest with much more than my personal conviction, just as the denial of an ideology actually misconstrues how ideology works. Comparatively speaking, I would want to understand the production and reproduction of race and racism on a world scale around three pivot points that for me write out the politics of change. The first of these concerns an understanding of contemporary capitalism and the logic in which it has lived and lives. Here I'm influenced by the work of C.J. Robinson, and particularly his book, Black Marxism from 1983. This work has been rediscovered in recent years, although some betray an awkwardness with the second term in sharp contrast to the fluency with the first, another antinomy perhaps. A central concept in Black Marxism is racial capitalism, and while this is also a term that is often invoked without having been read, at least within the Black radical tradition that Robinson details, it is a pertinent provocation about the necessity of comparatism in the articulation of anti-racism. Very briefly, Robinson, in a detailed and heavily referenced analysis, shows how capitalism, rather than being a break from the racialist hierarchies deployed within feudalism, integrates its racist modes of differentiation as an accumulation practice. The slavery of colonialism is not incidental to capital accumulation, but a vital cog in trade and profit. Robinson does not just critique normative histories of capitalist development or evolution, but also provides a methodological riposte to the metaphysical proclivities in reading capital. And not surprisingly, Hegel and Aufhebung come into this. I'll say more about dialectics in a moment. True, arguments about the co-constituency of slavery and capitalism are not new. Eric Williams published his tome on the subject in 1944. But the point is, Robinson is able to integrate the historical integuments with a body of Black thinking around racism and capitalism, Du Bois, James, Wright. Thus, it is both a direct challenge to the homilies and assumptions of Marxism and a guide to reformulating the radical edge of such critique, hence the title. There are many forms of racism and capitalism, even within ideologies of Herrenvolk and the nationalism of European bourgeoisies. Nevertheless, racial capitalism is a powerful heuristic, one that not only sheds light on the persistence of supremacist phantasmagoria in white identity, but also calls into question the introjection of racialist hierarchization in bourgeoisies of color. The treatment of South Asian migrant labor in the UAE, for instance, or that which mediates the malevolence of minoritizing in Myanmar, China, and Syria, the Rohingya, Uyghur, and Kurds, respectively. The challenge of comparative studies of race and racism from this perspective is that the transformation of global capitalism cannot be restricted to the arrogance and idealism of whiteness, even if, as Robinson rightly emphasizes, it continues to overdetermine the ways in which capitalism can be thought. So the second point connects to the first around the subject of the human, and especially the human as subject. There are many touchstones in this regard. Sylvia Wynter's polemic is particularly influential, but obviously the subject of subjection has been strongly linked to formations of liberalism and liberal humanism in particular. Here again, a significant epistemological challenge is raised. Think of the work of Lisa Lowe, for instance, and genealogies of reason and rationalism have been called into question. If the encounter with racial capitalism necessitates a discrepant double consciousness, a troubled binding or comparatism of political economy and the socio-political, the place of humanism is at once wrought with contradiction, caught between the liberation of becoming human and the weight of history that excluded humans in its own name. Despite polemical declarations, a kind of radical dog whistling intended to counter the anxious whistling of white enemy, there is a space for strategic humanism, something akin to what Gayatri Spivak once argued about essentialism. Paul Gilroy's Holberg lecture of 2019, for instance, underlines that cultural critique does not necessarily have to abhor humanism in the face of contemporary formations of xenophobia and neo-fascism, modes of ossified genericism of white identity gone mad with the cruel optimism in nostalgia of the truths in human solidarity shattered by the shibboleths and instantaneity of fakery, of that distinctly American investment in the nano-polemics of whatever. Gilroy's is a cautionary tale about managed or curated ignorance. And here a comparatist critique of race can be humanized. Gilroy, and I quote, follows Fanon and others in arguing that the intrinsic eye for racial difference should never be assumed or asserted as a defining feature of our species' hardwiring. Comparative historical and cultural analysis reveals that those sensitivities are the outcome of iteration, perhaps that repetition that Lydia was talking about, and education, which generate the habitual patterns Fanon presented as the workings of racial corporeal schemata, unquote. Humanism does not govern this discourse, but acts as a resource of hope among others in comparatively engaging it. Gilroy, for instance, references Equiano's revelation of the plight of Genoese slaves. Gilroy notes, and again I quote, the resulting mix of resources furnishes us with a compass we can use to locate newer and better understanding of the human considered post-anthropologically, that is, after the death, and I would say overrepresentation, of man, capital M, unquote. In his conclusion, Gilroy invokes Fanon again on the necessity for a real dialectic between the body and the world. And it is to this question that I would offer a third pivot. As a paragon of understatement to say Hegel's dialectics represents a problem for the decolonization of race would seem to negate in advance all attempts to motivate his thought towards a liberation from racism, comparative or otherwise. As Cicciariello Meher's recent book, Decolonizing Dialectics, suggests, however, it is difficult to understand the anti-racist and anti-colonial polemic of Fanon without reading the Hegelian dialectic itself as a paradigm in the service of global comparatism. The Arab Spring, Occupy, and BLM all suggest that far from an Hegelian end of history, time has been reborn and reconfigured in new solidarities new configurations of the politically possible. Rather than a teleological absolute, such anti-authoritarian constituencies offer a countermand to reasonable dialectics. What Gilroy calls real dialectics in the Fanonian grain is in fact an interruption of the real, in which racialism is normalized. That's that banalization too, I think, that Liddy refers to. In a sense, it is a dialectical critique of dialectics, and this is not an opening to decolonial exceptionalism, but to racial comparatism. Why? A decolonized dialectics does not posit false unity, but nevertheless grapples with the promise of solidarity among and between races on a world scale. It cannot assume totality or solidarity because it is based on contradiction, and makes of comparatism a political challenge. It takes the combined and uneven distribution of racial capitalism as a condition of struggle, not as an alibi of false equivalence. This has been called wayward dialectics. That's a term used by Antonio Vasquez Arroyo. While not a metonym for the waywardness Saadia Hartman describes, I would like to think it destabilizes the conditions of comparatism, not to harden autonomy into irredeemable separatism, but to make us humble before a project much greater than ourselves. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm going to return to Zahi's opening remarks on the question of analogy in Wilderson's work, because this panel was an opportunity for me to read Afropessimism. And I just want to set out a few remarks about the question of analogy and paradigm in Wilderson's vision of Afropessimism. So in Afropessimism, Frank Wilderson warns against the ruse of analogy, as Zahi mentioned, the erroneous belief that different targets of racialized violence can in fact be put into contact. Wilderson sees anti-Black violence as the paradigm of oppression. Black suffering is, quote, the life force of the world, and Blackness is inextricably tied to slaveness. In this searing account, to draw analogies between different positions, as Zahi reminded us, between, say, Muslims, Native Americans, or Jews with Black suffering, is actually to erase its singularity, its constitutive exclusion from a common humanity. Blackness in this account is a paradigm of social death against which humanity and social cohesion have been established. So in the few minutes I have, 8 to 10, I want to reflect on this refusal of analogy and this reliance on paradigm in ways that might resonate with what Peter has just said when we seek to theorize across different histories of racialized violence. Reading Wilderson about the exceptional but foundational nature of anti-Blackness, its incommensurability with other kinds of violence, I was really struck by the resonances and even the analogies with approaches to the Holocaust that posit it as an irreducibly singular event and as the paradigm of racial violence and human rights abuses, especially in universalist places like the France that Lydie describes. The middle passage in one account, the Shoah in the other, both set up as an exception to and a foundation for capitalist modernity as paradigms for violence and dehumanization, though one is the constitutive outside of humanity and modernity, and the other is its rule. In relation to the Holocaust as exception and rule, I will just mention George Agamben's well-known declaration at this point that Auschwitz is the hidden nomos of modernity. And I quote him, "Auschwitz is precisely the place in which the state of exception coincides perfectly with the rule, and the extreme situation becomes the paradigm of daily life." In this argument, Auschwitz is the hidden norm of daily life. Its violence is rehearsed identically in sports stadium and in refugee camps. And this proposition actually proceeds, here I'm just going to get kind of lit theory, lit rhetorical here, by abstracting a historical place, Auschwitz, into a universal condition through metonymy, if not synecdoche, or part for whole, like all hands on deck. And so to stand in for a permanent state of exception. In this account, the moribund detainee in camps such as Auschwitz, called Muslim by those in the Nazi camps, is turned into the paradigm of bare life or homo sacer, That is to say, life reduced to pure biological exposure to sovereign violence. And here I can't get into it, but really bears mentioning that the designation of what were primarily Jewish detainees in Primo Levi's work in these camps as Muslims itself raises the issue of comparative racialization in all sorts of ways that are too complicated to get into, but I just wanted to flag that. But in any case, the Holocaust continues to function as a paradigm for racial violence, human rights abuses, and genocide. It is the exception that unveils the rule. A historical phenomenon is made abstract, and an exception is turned into paradigm and immutable condition. So Afropessimism displaces the Holocaust as the paradigm for racial terror. Slavery is the exception. Black social death grounds conception of the human, of social coherence, of life itself through its exclusion. So while Agamben posits Auschwitz as the underlying rule of daily life, we are all virtually hominis sacri, for Wilderson, the slave ship and plantation underlie every aspect of Black life and its exclusion from humanity. Now, Wilderson, again, warns against any analogy between the Holocaust and slavery because for him, the former, the Holocaust, is a human Holocaust. The latter, slavery, is a human and a metaphysical Holocaust. The middle passage was an ontological transformation of Africans into Black in Wilderson's account, a category that's outside of the human altogether, designating something and not someone. Now, there are surely links to be made between propertization and extermination, and there would also be things to say about the entanglement of colonial and anti-Black histories with the Holocaust itself, as thinkers such as Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon point out. And I'm not going to engage further with this distinction that Wilderson makes between slavery and the Shoah, further beyond referring you to Zahi's article on Afropessimism and how Wilderson actually is provincializing in really important ways the analysis of Auschwitz as the site for understanding exceptional violence. So Afropessimism argues for the singularity of Blackness compared to other racial formations. If the Muslim is the emblem of bare life in certain approaches to the Holocaust, slaveness is the condition in which Blackness is fixed for Wilderson. Blackness is a paradigm for social death. It is paradigmatic in its exceptionality. Anti-Blackness is a structural condition, an immutable condition that stretches from the slave ship and the plantation to the streets of Ferguson or Minneapolis. So slavery is not a historical moment, but a condition that is incommensurable with other racialized formations. Hence the denunciation, as Zahi reminded us, of analogy as a ruse. In this view, cross-racial solidarity is a mystification. Wilderson, I quote him here, non-Black people of color can crowd out discussions of a Black grammar of suffering by insisting that the coalition needs to focus on what we have in common. And here too, I just wanted to point out, we can hear echoes of the hierarchies of suffering that come up in certain approaches to the Holocaust. And the vocabulary of crowding out recalls what Michael Rothberg has termed a kind of real estate approach to racialized violence. The major difference between these approaches, as I see it, is that when the Holocaust is proposed as a universal paradigm, it is often to subsume slavery, colonialism, and other minoritized histories of racial violence by way of a universal model of recognition. And this is certainly the case from the perspective of France, as Lydie has indicated. If the Holocaust is a paradigm for the recognition of human rights violations, Afropessimism, at least in Wilderson's view, rejects such recognition, since Blackness is a condition of absence and abjection on which the human and its regime of recognition and rights are based. This position outside recognition and representation is also a rejection of linear narratives of progress, of history's emancipatory curve. For Wilderson, we have to burn it all down for the possibility of the new to emerge. Now, I share Wilderson's wariness of analogy, but maybe not for the same reasons. Analogies do have the potential for illuminating connections, but they can also set up the kinds of false or frozen universal equivalences that Peter brought up, reducing different histories and subject positions to an identical structure. But I'm also wary of the proposition of a paradigm and its structure of identity. We are still in Auschwitz, slavery is still happening. Instead of the poverty of analogy or the fixity of paradigms, it seems to me that there are more promising paths to theorizing the continuities and the ruptures between slavery and current anti-Black violence, the continuities and ruptures between, say, the Nazi camp and refugee detention. The violence we're witnessing today at the borders, and I'm thinking about borders these days, which is why I turned to that, where racialized migrants are brutally repressed, is neither a repetition of slavery nor a continuation of colonial duress. And it might be maybe a kind of recombination, as Peter evoked. It's an interplay of securitarian violence and paradoxical forms of humanitarian care, with technology creating new forms of racialization. Detention facilities like hotspots are neither concentration nor extermination camps, but sites of sorting and parsing that have technologies and configurations of violence of their own, and yet that are, of course, linked to longer histories of racialized terror and repression. So the afterlives of slavery, colonialism, indenture, or the Holocaust are not governed by repetition or emancipatory rupture, but by what Ann Stoler has described as partial reinscriptions and entanglements. Similarly, coalitions emerge from partial affinities and affiliations rather than total analogy or identity in the struggle to exist, to survive, and to live a livable life. I'm reminded here of Toni Morrison's beloved when Paul D says to Sethi that he wants to put his story next to hers, or Asadjiba, who wants to speak not for the other, but right up against, or tout contre. And for me, literature and its figures are much more generous and generative than some of these theoretical paradigms when it comes to such relations. These figures of proximity rather than equivalence, adjacence rather than convergence, seem to open up forms of solidarity that neither fall into capture nor co-optation. And we saw this solidarity happen, not in the realm of rhetoric, literary or theoretical, but in bodily form on American streets just last summer, when a pandemic that is killing more Blacks, Latinx, and Native Americans than whites starkly illuminated an ongoing epidemic of racism that includes several legacies, including that of settler colonialism. And here I'm just gonna share screen and just show you an image. Can you see it? Okay, so frontline and essential workers, disproportionately Black and brown, fully grasp the intersection of public health and race. Already the most exposed to the virus after the killing of George Floyd, they took to the streets with signs that read, racial justice equals healthcare, racism is the pandemic, racism is the public health emergency. And to be honest, I'm still trying to figure out and to figure the relations that are drawn here on these signs between epidemiology and racism, the complex equivalences between the COVID virus and the plague of racism. So I'll just conclude on a question. How do the models of exceptionality and paradigm I've evoked help us to grasp what is actually being claimed here between literal and figurative plague, between epidemiology and racism, in signs that are brandished by differently racialized bodies marching right next to each other, tout contre, in solidarity and protest? Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides. It is. So I wanted to start with these two recent pictures that struck many of us as we started the new year. In my work, I usually focus on the comparison between Blackness and the animal question. But looking at these two pictures side by side and the events that unfolded that day, I feel like these two pictures should be part of a wider conversation about Blackness and the animal question. Why should a Black Lives Matter protest be experienced as a threat to national security when an insurrection at the Capitol is taken so lightly? The answer is wilding. The word comes from urban slang, referring to youngsters going crazy and raising hell in groups in a public setting. But the semantics took a turn for the worse in 1989, when it was used by the prosecution to lock up Black kids. The Central Park Five, as we know it, were 5 African-American teenagers who admitted to wilding in Central Park the night when a white woman jogger got raped. An admittance of wilding, as in being crazy with a bunch of friends in a public space, was used against them and turned into a racially motivated rhetoric of wild beasts raping white women. In 1989, the highly popular and sexually suggestive song Wild Thing by Tone Loc sealed the deal for the prosecution, and in a hyper-sexualized Black Beast rapes white woman kind of narrative. But all in all, we see that the human-animal divide has been a central paradigm to dispose of the Black body and to treat Blacks as less than human. Sylvia Wynter brought it to a point in her 1994 article when she talked about police semantics in Los Angeles. At the time, some of the police would use NHI as a code word for Black people from inner city ghettos, NHI meaning no humans involved. Even with horns on their heads and fur falling down their shoulders, surrounded by a pack of unleashed men screaming for destruction and death, the men on these pictures were never seen as wild animals, beasts that need to be contained. The Capitol insurrectionists will never be seen as wilding, unlike Black Lives Matter protesters. This brings me to the topic of the day, comparative racisms. And I go back to Desbaratis, Frank Wilderson's main argument. So his main argument in his 2020 lyrical memoir, Afropessimism, is that when it comes to racism and oppression, nothing compares to anti-Black racism. Blackness, as the byproduct of the Middle Passage and slavery in the Americas, is based on the unique experience of not being human. Black slaves were chattel, meaning personal property, chattel being etymologically related to cattle. Before being an Afro-pessimist, Wilderson believed in the analogy of racisms. He believed that his plight as a Black man in America was analogous to the plight of Palestinians, Native Americans, or proletarians, until he understood that nothing compares to the Black experience because Blackness, as he says, is the only non-human experience in modern history. As he says, if you think of parasites as capital, colonialism, patriarchy, or homophobia, those parasites are, as he writes, humans, all humans, the haves as well as the haves not. This is the difference between, as he writes, humans who suffer through an economy of disposability and Blacks who suffer by way of social death. His argumentation goes back to Sylvia Wynter and the idea that Blackness is based on the lack of the human, as she says. Blackness is the only condition in its very construct, in its essence, or in its way of coming to existence that is not based on humanity. So Blackness, according to Wildeson, is not about stripping people of their land or their rights, because for Blackness, there was never anything to strip off to begin with. In other words, talking about analogy when it comes to Blackness does not make sense. It's a deceiving and false premise. And as Desbaratis said, the ruse of analogy goes back to that. We can refer to this idea as the Black exception. Anti-Black racism, according to Wildeson, is the only condition that is not part of the system, and therefore it is not analogizable. I could have gone two ways from here. I didn't know if I should talk about the dreaded comparison between the non-human and anti-Black racism, or if I should talk about the French exception. So I decided to do a little bit of both in just a few words. So I'll start with non-human. Speciesism, by way of analogy with racism, sexism, and any other isms, is defined as discrimination against the animal species based on the assumption of human superiority. Comparing speciesism and anti-Black racism is part of a tradition in the animal rights discourse, a tradition that I often contest. But at the same time, there is no doubt that Blackness and the animal question are everywhere and cannot be ignored, and even in Wilderson's work. As we said, Wilderson's main claim is in his work on Afropessimism is that the Black condition is without analog. It cannot be compared. It's in a non-human class of its own. In an article, Wilderson put side by side the worker in the slaughterhouse and the Black,
And he says that the worker, even though he's exploited, is part of civil society, whereas the Black is not associated with the worker, but with the cows. The author writes, the cows are not being exploited, they are being accumulated, and if need be, killed. A phenomenon similar to what Black bodies have endured during slavery, but also today in America's industrial casserole system. As Wildeson argues, the chief difference today compared to several hundred years ago is that today our bodies are desired, accumulated, and warehoused, like the cows. What Wildeson shows is that it is very difficult to stay away from comparing anti-Black racism and what we call speciesism, because animalization and racialization together are part of the fabric of this country, as we have seen in the example of wilding. In that sense, it is important to talk about the comparison between animal and Blackness, if only to dismantle it. But we have to be careful with how we use it. The comparison cannot be used to further dehumanize the Black condition. I'm thinking here of Marjorie Spiegel's famous book published in 1989, again, same year as the Central Park Five. The book is entitled The Dreaded Comparison, Human and Animal Slavery. And in this book, Spiegel compares modern animal cruelty with Black slavery, a type of comparison, and here two pictures side by side of the comparison, a type of comparison that the animal rights organization, PETA, would use also in 2005 in its exhibit, Are Animals the New Slaves? And this is where the so-called dreaded analogy becomes problematic. Maybe I shouldn't have gone there. When it is used in an opportunistic way, in this case, to further the animal rights cause without paying much attention to its dehumanizing effect on Blacks. When one tries to make a point, not everything should be analogized or compared. Now, the second thing I wanted to address today, going back to Wildeson's idea of the Black exception, is that I wonder at times what Black means. Is Black in an African-American context the same as in a French context? Are these two expressions of so-called Blackness comparable? It seems to me that the afterlife of slavery, such as an important concept in Afropessimism, is different in America and in France. France is a country that always prided itself with being a slavery-free zone. Nul n'est esclave en France. There are no slaves in France is an old edict from 1315 from King Louis X that made slavery illegal in France. The French call it the freedom principle because it is based on the principle that any slave setting foot on French soil would be free. The goal of France was to profit from slavery out there in its colonies, while claiming that its enlightened conscience could not bear the sight of slavery on its own soil. It's like, as we say in French, pas vu, pas pris, not seen, not caught, or catch me if you can. Ironically enough, France is one of the few nations, if not the only Western one, that commemorates the National Day of the Abolition of Slavery every year on May 10th. Maybe it's easier for the French to work through their history if it's not really their history or if they don't see it as such. So when we talk about the afterlife of slavery, I think that it's more straightforward in America than it is in France. Not to say that there is no such thing in France, only that it's different and more insidious in a French context. Wilderson sees Blackness as a class of its own. But which Blackness are we talking about? Is Blackness a universal context? Should Blackness itself be a subject of comparison from one side of the Atlantic to the other? In other words, and this is the last question I will have for you, is there such a thing as comparable Blackness? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for a wonderful series of talks here. I would like to leave it open for our panelists, maybe to exchange some thoughts.
I mean, I could go and maybe invite Lydia. I have lots of questions for all of you, but maybe I'll just start with Lydie. Thank you for that. I was wondering, in this repetition that you note, the rehearsal of the injury in the reiteration of the insult, right? You were talking about it in terms of language. And of course, the example of the Egyptian who jumps into the sen and the epithet that was used to designate him, that whole thing also visually brings up the image of the drowning of Algerian protesters in the Seine in 1961 who were protesting during the Algerian War, which is precisely when these terms, such as the one you mentioned, were really circulating. And I was also thinking, I don't know if this might be similar or related, of the extraordinary violence of the constant looping of the slaughter of George Floyd last summer. And I guess I was wondering if you could maybe, I don't know, reflect on the image in relation to language as the medium of injury, if that makes sense.
Sure. When I presented the first event, I insisted on the fact that there was a young policeman. There was a group of policemen between 22 and 27, I believe. So the first shock, my first reaction was that this term, as well as the other one, are actually anachronistic. And the kind of shock, the discrepancy was between the new generation, these young white policemen, retrieving from some kind of collective memory this insult. That again we can relate in the kind of genealogy that I was trying to trace to Papon being the professor of Paris and the Algerians in the Seine in 1961. So in a sense, I believe that it's the amnesia, not only from the perspective of the French policemen, because these young kids. Where is it that they have actually heard the term, right? I believe that it's in a police culture, right? I believe it is because Papon is one of their great-grandfathers, that the police culture has allowed the repetition, the kind of private repetition of this insult. So my shock is first at even the possibility that this word would survive in the new generation in France, but also at the possibility of the reiteration of the term, again, unproblematically, in the French public sphere, as if, again, there was no room in French, in the French Constitution, either for the quotes or for the term or concept of race. So it is kind of part of this better known, wider denial. You say Benedict pas vu pas pris. It's like no race, no racism. It's the same kind of choice of ignorance that I was trying to trace in this kind of genealogy of the possible reiteration of a term like Biko.
Lydie, maybe if I can follow up here. I was also taken by this, the repetition, the consumption of this, dirty N-words. And I was trying to think, comparing it with the George Floyd's consumption of Black suffering, this kind of hunger, and that Sadie Hartman warns about, right? This kind of consumption of white America consuming anti-Blackness. And so one side, you can have the enjoyment that racists get from hearing the N-word repeated, right? And here, the white supremacist is both the right-winger and some kind of liberal as well, right? Participate in that general economy of anti-Blackness. But I'm wondering from the perspective of the so-called enlightened citizen, and if there isn't a surplus, what Lacan calls a surplus enjoyment of enjoying hating the racists, in a sense, then they become the exception, right? I'm not a racist like these people, like this bad cop, right? And in that sense, that reproduces this the baseline, right? The banality of racism, the everyday racism gets eclipsed. So ironically, the more attention you pay to these kind of events, you forget about the other everyday forms of racism. So how do you, I mean, and this is perhaps for all the panelists here, how do you intervene? How do you disrupt that surplus enjoyment that liberal culture thrives on?
Well, I don't have answers except that I would be in favor. It's probably a very American kind of point of view and a very a sign that I'm an immigrant in America and not so much a French citizen anymore. But I would be in favor of legal action in the same way that there is a law in France condemning racial insults. There should be a law in the land of Bourdieu, in the land of Barthes, and against the kind of symbolic violence that these sorts of repeating, re-inscribing of words allows in the quotidien. I do believe that there is a sort of a pervert kind of jouissance, both from the left and from the gauche, at the very possibility of being able to print these words. It has to do, that's a different conversation, that has to do with the one of the sacrosanct values of the Republic being the liberté de presse, freedom of press. So there is a kind of a very French jouissance at the very possibility of being able to see, to read, and to actually utter and repeat these words within the conscience of the Republic, I think, as opposed to the states.
And it's almost a sense that the real victim here is the Republican ideal that suffers in these scenarios. That it's not the actual Blacks, the beurre that get victimized, is a certain imago of the French citizen that's got hurt. So if there's an outrage, it's an outrage about the certain projection of the French nation rather than the actual people who have gotten the violence, who are on the receiving end of the violence.
Perhaps another point to make in this regard is that, I mean, I don't want to overdo this word, but there is an antinomy in the reporting of violence and the reproduction of violence in the reporting, right? So I think, it raises a question. In addition to the violence of the language that Lydia is pointing to, whether there's some kind of formula for, legal or otherwise, for erasing that and still reporting, right? So I'd be very interested if, I think part of the problem now is that the techne of repetition, right? That we live in a period where that reproduction that Lydia's pointing to can be intensified fairly easily. The meaning of racism is quite horrific, and it showed up again in the event that Benedict was citing. And certainly, as you point out, Zahi, in the murder of Floyd. So that's another, that's another dimension to this. You don't want to end up saying that, coming up with a kind of technologically determinist argument around the production and reproduction of racism. But it's really interesting how that techne mediates the discourses of racism and adds harm to harm.
I should also add, and then I will maybe we'll go on to something else, but I should also add that this is also in the context of the anniversary and trial of the Charlie Hebdo, and another event that we can superimpose into it, speaking of who is the victim, etc., where it seems to be that the imperative and the urgency for the French Republic is more towards holding on to the freedom of press, as in the caricatures of the prophet, than to addressing the actual racialization of society and this banalization of racist language or caricature. I mean, there's also symbolic violence in caricature, but that's a different topic. But thank you for your question. I'm ready to ask you a question then.
Can I just really quickly follow up though, and just, you know, coming back to this reproduction of racism through the, you know, just the insane circulation that technology enables here. I would be really interested to think about the relationship of epithet to image, you know, and frame. So I just wanted to put that out there.
And I just wanted to talk a little bit more about that is the difference, again, in a comparative framework, the difference between the way the French function and the Americans function is, it's a little bit like what I forgot which short story it was, when the best way to hide something is to hide it in plain sight, the purloined letter. And this is a little bit what's happening in France, is this compulsion of iteration is a way to say, this is, I have nothing to hide by saying it. And when they have so much to hide, right? And they're hiding the whole history of slavery. So the more you say it, and the more actually you frame yourself as having nothing to hide. So there will never be a moment of racial reckoning for them in that sense. And it goes also with a memoir by Thomas Chatterton Williams, Self-Portrait of a Black Man, when it's the story of an American, biracial American, raised Black in America, who goes to France and decides that he really enjoys the colorblindness of France, but from an American perspective, in kind of in a naive way. And he marries a French woman, and he ends up in Normandy at his wife's grandmother's place, and he's having lunch, and he looks around and he sees on the table a head of typical racist head from the Pekingese, or a slave even. I think it was the head of a slave on display, and he's very shocked. And that's when his Frenchness, his wannabe Frenchness stops, because he's not used to having the history of slavery and racism in full display. Whereas in America, it's the other way around. When you see again this country music star yesterday who got caught on video using the N-word, and it feels like it's happening every week. So the more you try to hide it and find a codification to go around it, the compulsion will be always to come back. And you think after all these years and in a society of cancel culture, how can you still be caught using the N-word? It's very surprising, but there is this compulsion, you know, to against hiding it. Whereas, so it's exactly the opposite, I think, the way that the French system works and the American system works.
I don't know whether this is helpful at all, but it would also seem that there's an assumption that the individual within the American frames of speech is assumed to be able to adjudicate their own ideology. Whereas, you know, the concept of ideology ipso facto overdetermines how one sees oneself and what one is privileged to speak or not, right? So maybe it also has to do with how the will, freedom of will, let's say, in an American grain is constituted or at least articulated.
This is just a comment, but it's so fascinating to me, though, that any discussion of race, if it takes place at all in France, somehow is looped through the US and the question of how the US actually conceptualizes race in relation to multiculturalism. I just wanted to put it out there.
Which is a model to fear often. Like, you know, we don't want to become like the Americans, this kind of identity politics, and give up, right, the privilege of the universal that, you know, that speaks for humanity.
And it's even terrifying.
Yeah.
It's actually a kind of colonialism.
I think we have our first question that might actually be touching on a comparison between the American and French. So I'll read the question here. So on the question of laws against symbolic violence, I'm curious about how the notion of freedom of speech gets deployed similarly or differently in France and the US as a way of avoiding intervening in these practices.
So it's a question for somebody who knows both how it's deployed in France and how it's deployed in the US. So we're going to have to collaborate.
Yeah. Who wants to take the French side?
I think that in the French law, the racist, how do I put it, Benedict? Maybe you can help me. Injure à caractère raciste, or what is it? Okay, insult, a kind of racist insult, I guess. And as you know, I'm obsessed with language. So we could also think about the difference between racist remarks or racist slurs and this idea of bavure. This like it's you know, as you said, somebody is overheard saying something. But anyway, so the issue of the will to hurt, I think, is the fundamental criteria to condemn somebody to legally condemn somebody on the grounds of racist insult. However, and that's why I'm interested in the ways that these are kind of naturalized. If you cannot prove the will to hurt, it's impossible to write unless you use a team of linguists, of semiologists and mythologues. It's impossible to demonstrate in a French court that something is racist or not if you cannot demonstrate this will to hurt, the malevolent aspect of it. Correct me if I'm wrong, Benedict, but
yeah.
I think.
Yes, you're right. And there are a few cases, infamous cases of celebrities getting fined for, and the word that we're looking for, and I forgot exactly the expression that's being used for racist comments, like Brigitte Bardot, she has been fined many times. And also the perfume maker, Guerlain, he was being interviewed on French TV, national TV, and used an expression. And this is why it becomes tricky. He used an expression that many French use still today, which would be very shocking for Americans. He said, "J'ai travaillé comme un nègre," which means I work, talking about his new perfume, I work like a Negro, or N-word. J'ai travaillé comme un nègre. And he was not fined for saying "j'ai travaillé comme un nègre" because it's been used many, many times. He was fined for what he added after that. He said, well, if the expression is accurate. So he made fun of Blacks for not being that hardworking. And I think that's why he got fined. And he apologized after that. So you have to go the extra mile to get fined, because it's a very paradoxical kind of culture, because the N-word, nègre in French, or Negro, depending on how it's being used, is used in everyday language for so many things, for pastries, for even being a ghostwriter, for working hard. So depending on the context, it's not seen as transgression. And in other contexts, if it's ultra explicit, then you will get fined.
Debarati, I'm wondering how this might be at work in Holocaust deniers in France, in the sense that there is much more attention given there, what you can say and cannot say, what can you publish and not publish. So there might be, that dimension might be factor in guiding the production of racist discourse and anti-Semitism as a paradigm. And of course, it becomes, how do you generalize that paradigm? Any criticism of Israel becomes anti-Semitic, hence to be censored. And then that's mixed with nice Islamophobia. And then you have confusion of analysis.
Yeah, you've just said it, Zahi. It's this sort of closed system where if you are actually yes, criticizing Israel, you are immediately anti-Semitic, and it is a competitive economy that it's very sort of structured. I don't really know how to say more unless you wanted me to say more about France, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, or other panelists on this question, or
Yeah.
United States. I mean, how is the United States model more desirable, less desirable in some circumstances? I mean, there's a kind of fetishizing of freedom of speech that is used to censor folks at universities, academic freedom. And how is that playing with racist discourse or the circulation of white supremacists? That now they're the most targeted, right? They can't express themselves. So they use the language of the left to try to make it a right issue. I have a right to be a racist, right?
Right.
I had a question to add to that, which I don't know whether it complicates it or not, but are there any limits to pivoting an analysis of comparative racism using nation-state-based arguments, i.e., you know, the US as a model, as you put it, Zahi?
And I would have another question that might add to that, which is when we're talking, and it might be coming back to Benedict's point of, you know, are there different forms of Blackness? You know, as I was reading Wilderson, I kept thinking about the caste system in India, for example, and the kinds of speciesism that the caste system itself can rehearse, right?
Just the
I mean,
work
part
of
of my question was thinking about this, you know, Debarati's work on migration, for instance, that the trass, as it were, racism is also carried by the migrant, and the migrant is identified in those terms and sort of re-racialized wherever that person goes. So, you know, that would, for me, be another vector of how to understand the comparative mode in the analysis of the production and reproduction of racism.
So
I could address this just a little bit, but I think Benedict, you were ready to.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Well, what is really, and again, shocking and insulting and offensive in the ways the French deal with anti-Blackness, with the ways the Black Lives Matter not emerged, but was pursued in France, almost unfortunately using the same acronym. The offensive dimension of this French denial is in the kind of rhetoric claiming that whatever resistance or decolonial kind of claims come out of France are necessarily imported from the United States, as if Africans, North Africans, Central Africans, etc., did not have, first of all, the lived experience or the means to actually think their own oppression, were it not for the United States. So it's true that when we talk about academics, intellectuals, etc., a lot of us have been able to voice and articulate these because we went to the States, right? But the actual awareness, and that's what, you know, Fanon never went to the States, you know, Fanon travels the other way, and there's a Fanonism in the United States that actually originates in Algeria and Martinique. So there is, in this kind of fallacy, French fallacy, there is this kind of anti-Americanisme primaire where whatever claims French blacks or browns have necessarily comes from the kind of, you know, politically correct American tradition, as if there were no other tradition to resist.
Benedict, did you want to?
No, it was just a quick comment about the this caste system and anti-Blackness. I think it's something that a lot of people work on right now. I was thinking of Isabel Wildeson, and it's all the question of entanglement, and not necessarily comparison, but staying away from comparison, but maybe dealing with solidarity and partial, as it was said, partial overlap and connections.
Yeah, I mean,
more than comparisons.
I mean, for me, I mean, all these reflections link to, from a French perspective, seeing very little relevance of evoking gender or race as sites that could actually make you think the universal. So Alexander Wahilier has talked about, if race is relevant, let sociology tackle it, right? Make it kind of minority discourse. It doesn't raise at the level of the universal discourse, where I think there is a move now to say, okay, can we have Black Lives Matter and not be another version of identity politics, but actually wanting to change the world, right? It can be elevated to the level of the universal. So Benedict, I was thinking of your observation how the capital feared Black Lives Matter more than these white supremacists. At some level, they were right, because I think Black Lives Matter was asking for radical change, whereas the white supremacists just want a reset button when the world was more white. So I think there's a French resistance to make it a universal question, making race, if it's at all acknowledged, making it a universal question. In America, things are not that much better either, right? Because identity politics takes care of race issues. It's never really incorporated at the kind of philosophical level of what is human, what is universal. And I think that's starting to change. I think scholars are intervening, saying, no, what this is highlighting something much more than identity politics, right? The interest of one particular group. It's the interest of the human, whatever the human means. And Sylvia Wynter, right? The genre of the human as man has to be dismantled and replaced by something different.
And that is where Wilderson's Burn It Down has real power.
Yeah. So perhaps we can look at some of the questions here that have been added. So we were talking earlier about barriers here, and I think maybe the reference to Wildeson might be useful. How might physical barriers like those discussed by Wildeson contribute to further isolating certain races in France? So maybe Debarati, you can speak to that.
I mean, I could maybe start with that, like isolating certain races in France, where one would immediately think of just the spatialization of the banlieue, for example, and the ghettoization of minoritized French people. And I guess, coming back, Peter, I guess I'm still having some trouble with the term comparative. It might just be, it's a blocage for me. And so I'm always a little bit deer in the headlights when, I'm like, okay, the comparison of one constituted thing with another, and so I'm having some trouble with that. But, thinking about the production of race, for instance, at borders, I guess was one of the questions that you were asking, right?
Yeah.
And how, or the reproduction of, very old forms of racialization, that's actually very clear. The kind of parsing and of the human species, literally rendered visible through, for instance, surveillance technology, infrared cameras, security footage, right? That actually, visualize this parsing of the human and the non-human. According to certain, visions of race. So I just thought I would come back to that briefly.
Yeah, I foresee the end of departments of comparative literature, and henceforth they will be called departments of entanglement or les rhizomes.
I mean, maybe Peter, a question that might be linked to what you work on, how at some level capitalism is, the breaking down of barriers, the whole world is interconnected. We talk about global capitalism, but as you have global capitalism, you have this kind of emergence of a new kind of apartheid logic, right? Those who benefit from the system and those whose life are systematically disposable. They don't matter, they don't count. So Membe evokes this idea that it becomes a luxury to be exploited. But some people don't have the chance to be exploited. They're just taken out of interests, right? Their life don't matter. Their lives aren't even recognized as existing, as worthwhile. So how do you make sense of capitalism destroying barriers, right? Making the market expanding, and at the same time these kind of new walls emerging.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. I mean, it is important in some of the current research that I'm doing, especially around biometrics and the use of biometrics in identification. I mean, Europe at the moment, sorry, the EU, they use this policy of externalization, so that their checkpoints, their actual, if you could think about this, they're sort of the bureaucratic border of the EU now is heavily ensconced in North Africa, not in Europe itself. The idea being that interdiction can begin before the migrant gets on the boat, or before the migrant takes a long journey through other countries, right? And so actually the US is helping in this. They've actually trained an Egyptian force in this kind of interdiction, with the idea being that one of the ways that you perform race as an immigration policy is to go to the places where these so-called ne'er-do-wells are coming from, right? And so there, the techne, to mention that term again, the techne is being used to actually reconstitute the geospace of the globe, right? And capital is heavily invested in that. And the weird thing is, right, that some of the same companies that are providing these technological resources for externalization are also the ones that are sort of policing the populations internally, right? And so there is this, I mean, I think there's a space for kind of Foucauldian categories here in terms of what that means in relation to how the political subject constitutes themselves against this sort of machinery that has been accelerated in its use by the labor requirements of globalization and neoliberalism.
Wonderful.
In fact, the highest percentage of those migrants are laborers.
Can I just dive in and add to that? That's so interesting, because I've been thinking, I've been looking at Ceuta and Melilla, which are these Spanish enclaves on the other side of Morocco, and that are in fact where they're, and the barrier, it's basically an outer barrier of the EU that's being funded by the EU. And where in fact, and it's such an interesting border because of course it is an outsourced one that is parsing and making sure like that the Moroccan side of the border keeps that border intact, preventing the ne'er-do-wells who are racialized from crossing. Meanwhile, the Moroccan civilians can actually, I think, cross the border with a particular kind of documentation that allows them to come back in carrying things that are duty-free if they carry it on their body, if it's hand luggage. So there's this extraordinary kind of circulation of goods on the one hand, which comes back to the free circulation of commodities under global capitalism and the restriction of migrants who are themselves in very obvious ways also turned into merchandise by these security systems and networks that you're talking about, whether it's America or the EU with its outsourced borders and their techne.
Great, thank you. I wanted to chime in actually to stay on the same issue, because I found with Mbembe the interesting proposition to think the society of enmity. In other words, that we think the desire to identify, locate, and fix an enemy in a given times. I mean, and our time being particular prone to that. And I think that this, what Mbembe calls the desire for an enemy, or the desire for apartheid, or the desire to erect walls, it takes it out of the spatial, actually, and is not incompatible with the kind of capitalist global desire to break down barriers, as the Baradi said, for the sake of the circulation of goods. So anyway, I wanted to respond to the person asking the question, referring to Glissa. I wanted to refer back to Mbembe, who invites us to think the current times as and societies as societies of enmity.
I think maybe we'll take one more question, and this last question is for Benedict. So I was wondering if the same kind of analyzation of the Black body in language and in practice can be seen in France as it is seen in the US.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, when you think of from l'Île de la Réunion, I'm trying to remember her name, the one who is responsible for the law about the ceremony of the abolition of slavery. What's her name?
It's either Taubira or Vergès.
Taubira, thank you. Taubira, there was a scandal a few years ago of a politician from the far right, the Front National, who put a picture of Taubira on one side and a monkey on the other side and said, look, the same, this is a baby monkey. It's her at 6 months old and it's her today. And this whole idea of simiesque and animalization is just as common as whether it's a politician in France with Taubira as Obama and Curious George the monkey as well. So I think all these semantics and iconography of racialization and animalization applies in the whole Black diaspora when it has to do with slavery, because again of this idea of construction of Blackness through slavery being the non-human.
Well, I think we're out of time, and this has been a spectacular roundtable. Thank you so much for delivering your papers and your responding to questions. I would like to remind folks who are still with us, if you want to contact me for the Zoom link, Zoom information for tomorrow's more intimate discussions with our speakers at noon. So thank you again, all of you.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow, everybody.
See you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you all. See you
you.
tomorrow.
This was such a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Zahi, for organizing it.
À bientôt.
À bientôt.
Bye,
Demain.
Bye, Benedict.
Bye. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.